Code software. Welcome to the To Code Software Podcast, Episode 11. I'm Tim Purdom.
And I'm Tim J.
And today we're going to have part 2 of a discussion about the MVVM framework. So we decided after our last discussion on MVVM that there was still quite a bit of detail that we wanted to talk about and just dig in a little bit further than we did the first time. Tim, should we start with a little more detail on the iCommand interface?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. So MVVM and WPF has a lot of things that Microsoft has provided for us. Really good base user controls and a lot of different things to help us out. But one of the things that they don't provide is a implementation of iCommand. And if there is one, I've never seen one that's provided from Microsoft. And iCommand is sort of the method version of binding, where normal binding is traditionally to properties. So like a text box would bind to a string property. iCommand is their way of binding to a method. And it encompasses basically the ability to execute a method with an argument and a Boolean which says, am I allowed to execute? This is used so that if you bind a button's click event to an iCommand, if that iCommand reports that it cannot execute, you can disable the button. So like you can't click save until all the validations have passed is a good example of that.
Right. Yeah, I always think of it more as like an extension of event handling. Basically, it's taking the event from, or the event handler from the view and passing it back to the model. I'm sorry, not the model, the view model, right? But as you said, it's only going to execute if it can execute. And yes. I know when we went to implement this for work and for some side projects, that the implementation of executing is simple. You just pass it a function, right? You just pass it, it can be a nameless function just within brackets, or it can be a named method that you pass to it. But the can execute, that's the hard one. Because, as you said, it could be checking various validation rules. It could be checking, did you do things in the right order? Did you remember to fill out all the boxes before you click save and all of that?
Yeah. The gotcha on that, and the only reason I knew about this is that when I first got started with MVVM, a lot of people online are like, hey, you really should use some sort of helper framework. MVVM Lite, a Prism, just somebody out there who's built kind of, here's a view model, here's a command, an iCommand implementation. And I don't remember which one I stole. I will just use the word stole. My implementation from, it might have been an MVVM Lite, because it was just a very simple set of, you have one function, which is the execute function. You have another function that is the determine whether or not it can execute. But there's this tricky little thing you have to add into the event handler, which basically does magic behind the scenes to tell the system to recheck the can execute method whenever certain things change. Because the can execute method, there's no built-in way to remind all of these iCommands that, hey, you might need to check if you can execute more often than not. And so there's this odd bit of wiring that needs to take place in order to make that work the way that you would expect it to.
Right. Yeah, and I did a really super simple implementation without any of those frameworks. And I'd be curious, because I don't even think you had a chance to look at my implementation of that. But it was essentially passing a reference to the view model, just as an iNotify property changed element, passing that into the command. And so then it just listened for any property changes in the view model.
Okay.
And whenever a property change happened, it would rerun can execute.
Oh, that's a nice simple way to do it.
Yeah. The only, downside is that you have that extra reference there. but it's just using the notify property changed interface. It doesn't actually care what kind of view model it's bound to. So that's a really simple way of doing it. But like you said, that's definitely the issue, is that it doesn't know when to check that can execute method.
Yeah. And then even passing in a notify property changed, you could do some nice things with that, like only listening to certain properties if you're aware that can execute hinges on that.
Mm-hmm.
But then you always have to worry about oh, but I'm adding an event handler, and so I need to remember to figure out how to remove that event handler and,
Right.
gotchas along those
Yep.
lines.
So then I also had to make relay command disposable and have a dispose method which got rid of the handler. Yep.
Hmm. It's really unfortunate that that happens, and that's often why these frameworks exist, is because trying to implement some of this stuff yourself, there's these really terrible corner case gotchas that you'll kind of stumble upon and be like, oh man, how do I ever fix this? And a lot of these frameworks do that for you. And it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the times that, I don't mind rolling my own when it comes to a lot of stuff. Just, hey, oh yeah, I want to see how to implement that. But as I've worked with MVVM, I really prefer using some sort of framework out there. I mean, I can make my own view model base and I can make my own I command, but there's so many edge cases that I would just rather find something, fairly lightweight out there that I can just use rather than having to
Sure.
roll everything myself.
Yeah, and I know you could do like direct event binding in the XAML, and I think we talked about that on the earlier episode, that I was
Yep.
using something WPF behaviors or something,
Oh,
which was
yes.
a small package for that kind of thing. Because yeah, I don't want to figure that out myself,
Yeah.
and I would probably have to write a whole bunch of code to do that when I could just download this package that already does it for me. The one other thing I will say is that the relay command implementation of iCommand that you often can find by Googling, I don't think it really solves that can execute problem.
If it uses that one weird line of code, the one I'm thinking of with the attaching to that static classes event refresh, it was the one that was used at work. I'm sorry,
Okay,
I'm not looking at it, so I can't remember it. If you
that's
put that in
right.
there, it does work. But if you don't put that in there, then you have to build some sort of event check or some other way of refreshing it.
Yeah, just to say that if you are implementing your own, or if you're looking for a very simple example online, make sure that can execute is actually implemented if you're planning on using it. Now, there's lots of cases when you can do a command and you just want it to always execute when the button is
Hmm.
clicked. So in those cases, you don't even need that part of iCommand. But there's certainly, if you're going to use it, make sure that it works.
Yeah. I suppose we should mention that when he's talking about relay command, that's just a very common name among many different frameworks of an I command implementation that really just calls methods. That's all it is it
Right.
just takes like an action or a function as the execute, and it takes a function as the can execute. So relay command generally just refers to an I command implementation that takes delegates in effectively,
Yep.
because there are other ones.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if we should jump and talk about reactive UI a little bit. Like, I know you
Yeah.
read some of the documentation for that, and I know one of our colleagues at work has done a lot of study on it and some implementation with it. So, can you tell me what that is?
Reactive UI, and even after reading some very excellent articles on this, because I haven't implemented anything myself, I'm still very fuzzy on it. But it's kind of a functional programming paradigm that's there
Mm-hmm.
to solve a lot of very complicated problems. And it does so in ways that are like thread safe and task safe, and it is very functional. The word monad started getting thrown around, so not having a lot of experience with functional paradigms, I was a bit lost in that. It
Right.
really just kind of is a way of pushing information and pulling information out, kind of like events would do. You can have these observables, and you can kind of say, whenever something needs to be mentioned, it can come in through an observable and you can learn about it and you can do things with it. Again, not having implemented anything, it's really hard for me to see its use case over other things, especially now that I started playing around with channels. At work, I really
Mm-hmm.
looked at channels and I'm like, I and I'm sure there's a million reasons why, but channels seem to do a lot of what reactive UI is intending on doing in a way that's seemingly less frustrating, because reactive UI was just way out there when it came to a lot of what it was doing. But
Sure.
it's kind of designed for these sort of UI situations where you're kind of saying, hey, this property changed. Here you go. Here's some information that this property changed. Hey, I clicked this button. Here's some information that I can kind of pass back about there. So it's a way of sending information between systems in a very async way, and it can do batch updates and a whole bunch of other stuff, but it was very confusing and very functional. So
Mhm. Yeah, I felt the same way when I read the code at work, and I know it's very functional in the sense that it's functional programming. It's also very functional in the sense that it works, but it was not easy to read as somebody with less experience in functional programming, so it definitely takes a different mindset. I've been listening to more and more podcasts about functional programming. I did take a workshop on it, like a full day or a 2-day workshop on it, and I feel like I'm just starting to understand it myself. But it's very interesting and fascinating, the parameters around functional programming where objects are not mutable. So essentially, you're always creating a new object every time you're passing information around, and a function should have no side effects. I mean, a function is essentially what we call a method in a class, right? But
mhm.
but it doesn't have to be in a class in other languages. And unlike a C# class method, it should not have side effects. It should always return the same result, no matter how many times you run it. If you give a function a certain input, you will always get the same output.
Sort of like a static method on a static class with no instance or like no state being saved anywhere in there.
Right, right.
Yeah. Well, that would be a fun podcast topic to have
Yeah.
you, like, once you get there and you can explain a monad and you can explain some of
Oh,
that. I'd
gosh.
love to hear more about that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. But I just wanted to talk about reactive UI today because I knew that we had run into that in relation to MVVM. And I know that our colleague was using some sort of observable function
Hmm.
that does some of what you were describing there. I can't remember if observable, it's not iObservable, but it's something like that where it's like watching for changes, and then when it gets a change, then it, like you said, pushes that forward. So
Hmm. Yeah, it's something I wouldn't mind continuing to read more about, as I do find it interesting. But like with most technologies, I have to really understand, why do I want to use this? Like, in
hmm
what circumstances is there? It's like our ORM discussion. There are really good use cases for Dapper. There are really good use cases for Entity Framework, but you have to know what that is. And I guess for me, I haven't found a situation where I thought that level of complexity was necessary. But
right.
and I'm sure they exist out there. I use a different MVVM framework, so I guess I have a solution to my problem already.
Yeah. Well, and everything's a trade-off. You can
Oh
do
yeah.
more. You can learn how to do something that looks very complicated, and then once you learn it, it may be very simple and make more sense to you. So
Mm.
another issue that we came up with at work, or that came up anyways as we were working, is the idea of nested view models, like one view model being inside another view model. Because, I mean, let's face it, you and I both have a lot of experience building component based UIs where
Yes.
everything is built on smaller building blocks throughout the UI. So then the question becomes, do you have one giant manager view model that controls all of the UI elements in the view? Or do you have nested view models that control different elements? So where do you stand on that question?
My view models contain view models. And this
Okay.
is a tiny preview of the next topic. I'm view model first centric. In my main bot project, when I developed the
Mm-hmm.
UI for what I call the dashboard, it was supposed to be very clean. There's nothing fluffy about it, there's nothing artistic about it. It's basically looks like a form that you fill out, spreadsheets and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. And when I first started developing it, because it's just a lot of data being presented in different ways, and then the UI is just ways of manipulating the underlying data. For me, because that's all it was, I ended up discovering that it all had to be view models everywhere, because each view model was really like responsible for a different entity. So I would have like
Right.
this bot configuration entity that needed its own view model. But then inside the bot configuration, there was like a bot add configuration, and that was a foreign key. So then that bot add configuration needed its own view model that was just another tab. And so the
Hmm.
tabs where you would go into a configuration, you would tab through all the different options. All of that ended up needing to be each one being a view model, because every one of my entities, which are my models, needed its own view model to wire it up. And so I just found myself in more and more situations where the correct thing was just nested view models in like an eye observable collection, because that was the way that my data was coming in. I was getting these huge hydrated nests of like bots that had configs that belonged to chains that had this, that had this. And so it was easier for me to kind of process that as, for each one of these things, make a view model, add it to this collection, continue to go through all of that. And so constructing my view models was very easy because I started with the data first. And then that led me toward our next discussion on view model first and my preferred application or MVVM framework called Stylet. But because I was coming with the data first, I struggled to do the view first, kind of every view just exists on its own. I struggled with that pattern because that wasn't how my data was coming into it. The view was just an afterthought. It was just whatever I need to be able to work with this data. The data was the important thing.
Right. I'm going to play devil's advocate, even though I probably mostly fall on the same side of that argument as you do. But let's take a devil's advocate position here, and let's take a specific example. Let's say we have a view that is a list of people. Okay.
Okay.
But then you can click and it will open up like a detail view of each person.
Okay.
So, like, maybe it's a collapsing, expanding row
Hmm.
type thing. What I described so far is just viewing, but let's say all of that's editable too, right?
Okay.
So you can now change anybody's address or their phone number or whatever. Can't you control all of that from a single view model? I mean,
Yes.
if you have a list of type person and each person has maybe even a list of phone numbers,
Hmm.
well, you still can bind to person dot phone number in the list, right?
Yes. You should be able
Okay.
to, provided that the lists are observable collections, which are,
Right.
I notify property changed equivalent for collections, which is another whole topic we could get into.
Right.
My thought there is, okay, so you're talking about editing it in line or something, but it could just as much be right click on that person, click on edit, and a little tiny pop up appears that has all of these editable fields. And
Sure.
for me, in my head, what I've built, that list of persons, isn't a list of persons in the view model. That is a list of person view models.
Right.
And then when that list binds to that view model might just have a dot display property or dot name or dot value or whatever, which is kind of an encompassing, hey, I'm going to pretend to just have like a display name and then maybe a value behind me. But then if I want to interact with that, then I already have that view model there and I can snap that up into a new view, or I can then bind right to that. Like if there's a list of phone numbers in there, well, then that's actually might just be a list of phone number. Or if we're getting even more complicated, that might be a list of phone number view models. Phone number is a bad example there, but like
Yeah.
you can nest them down. And then since these view models kind of are able to be bound as a just tell me what you want to look like, and then you
Right.
maybe don't care, or there is an underlying value, which is the model that's being collapsed in there, you don't lose any of your standard functionality with being able to say, display this person, and I want to get the person that I've selected, for example, as a selected value. But then you also still have the view model behind that, so you can do all of your binding and you can do whatever extra special stuff you'd want in there. So you have, say, a good spot to put phone number validation logic is in the
Mm.
phone number view model, or even just if the phone number is only really part of a person, then the person view model can have that logic rather than suddenly that logic needs to live higher up in the tree. And so it
Right.
kind of lets you focus in on the way that elements work.
Maybe it boils down to, do I want this smaller piece to be reusable
Hmm.
in more situations?
That's a fair way to look at
And I know that's where it came up at work. And the other part is how much logic needs to go into this view model.
it. Hmm.
And so at work, I developed a control that had its own view model because it had a lot of things in there. It had some validation in there. It had some, autocomplete of text. It had some key handling. And yes, I could have done all of that in the control itself, in the code behind and in the control. I absolutely could have. But I wanted those features to be testable, so I pulled them out into the view model. I also wanted them to be reusable in Xamarin Forms and Blazor, like we talked about,
Hmm.
so that I could reuse all of this same logic and just replace a really dumb view with, another view that would have all the same logic automatically in it. And so I'm happy with that decision, but at the same time, I understand why it causes more problems, because now whenever somebody wants to use that control, they now have to get a view model. And that brings us back around to that what comes first question. Because if you have to have a view model and a control, well, then how are you going to get both of them?
Hmm.
Or a view model and a view. It doesn't have to be a control,
Yeah.
but at every level that you decide that you need both.
MVVM is traditionally view based. Views try to get views. Views generate other views. And then generally, I know very early on it was the service locator pattern, which is an anti
Mm-hmm.
pattern, but it was what was used, was this kind of object that gets given to the view where it can request the backing view model for a view. And service locator is kind of like passing around your composite root for dependency injection, which is not a great idea, but it does work in that instance. And so that works, and that's fairly easy to wire up. And a lot of the MVVM frameworks that exist out there are kind of designed from that mindset. And that is
Right.
a thing that I ran into because I was very much like view model first for me, which I found my own package, or I found a package called Stylet, which was designed from the ground up to be view model first. And it passes around a locator not quite as bad as a service locator. It's sort of a control locator. I think it's called window locator. It's been a little while. But the idea is that a view model, like if you have any view model whatsoever, you can say, give me the view, give me the thing that I need to spit out. And that view may
Mm-hmm.
not be like a window. It could be a user control. It could be a button. It could be any defined, in this case, WPF control type. It will actually
Right.
get that based upon like your conventions of how you've configured it and all of that. The idea being is that the view is less important than the
Right.
view model. And Stylet kind of has that idea that you might want to have multiple different views per view model. And because you're requesting the view, you can kind of like get that. So let's say you've got a theming thing going on, you've got multiple different themes. Since the view model is the kind of the first thing, when it requests the view, if you've got some theme set somewhere, then it can give you different views depending on what you would like. I mean, you can do that
Mm-hmm.
anyway in the view by having like resource dictionaries, but switching on those gets a little bit more difficult. And so the view model first, then every view gets generated from the view model. And so if you nest view models, then each part of that can then be requested. So you can say, give me this view. Well, this view is expecting its own views inside of it, but then each one of those will then just get generated as the view models get newed up or referenced or whatever is going on there.
So Stylet does that linking for you, like it goes and
Yeah.
finds the view just based on convention, right? Just based
Yeah,
on.
the default convention is just as simple as if it's called X view model, it looks for X view. I think in the
Right.
same folder or similar hierarchy, there's many different ways of configuring it.
Sure.
Stylet also comes with these common view models. It has its own view model base and it has its own validation. But one of the things it also provides is these kind of preset up view models for the idea of like a tab control. Like it's a very common thing where you've got whatever type of control, and the idea is you only have one thing active at a time. This could be the same thing as a radio button, like display could use this same view model. And so in the backing store, it does all the view model stuff, but then it has this idea of, well, I've got a list of view models and each one of these things is an option, but then it also keeps track of for you, which is currently selected. And if you want to say click next and you want some sort of idea of what happens when you go next, it provides all the framework for you. So you can't like go before something that's too far to the left. You can't go too far to the right. And it's a bit more complicated than that, but it gives you those sorts of tools. And there's another one which is sort of a list backing where you've got multiple things and any number of them can be selected. There's an entire view model that gives you all of the behavior to do that and to very quickly bind to that. And now I'm talking about Stylet, but it also has this thing called action. And so using a very simple import in your XAML, when you're doing your binding, you put S colon, which is saying I'm using Stylet, and you call it action. And then action, you can give it a name, just a text name. And what it will do is Stylet will look for an actual method on your view model with that name. And that method can have any number of parameters, and those parameters can get bound, and it will actually call the method rather than having to do an I command and jump through all the hoops. But for can execute, you can make a Boolean property with the same name as the method or like a variant of that name, and it will just automatically bind to that as can execute, and it automatically does it in a way that since it's a property and you've got iNotify property changed, it only refreshes can execute when the property can execute for that method changes. So then you can just change that property in whatever validation logic you want and whatever other trigger that you want in the background and know that Stylet will pick it up and it will just bind it. So you no longer have to do any I commands at all. You just have your view model. Yeah, it's really cool, and it solves the problem with view model first. And I'm sure there are many situations where the view is important, but for me, coming from the idea that the view is very throwaway for me. It can look however it wants to look, it can do whatever it wants to do, but to me, it's all about the data, and that's why I think view model first is kind of the way that I would prefer to do it. I'm sure there are instances where the view is the ultimate awesome thing. We really don't care about anything else, but coming from a developer standpoint and kind of developing applications that are just kind of supposed to be used, not really like these pretty game interfaces or whatever, I find that we're closer to the data in that instance.
Yeah, I would say that I'm still ambivalent about view model versus view first. And one of the things I wanted to mention is some of the niceness of view first, which is that you can do things literally in the XAML. You can say view.data context and then make the opening brackets, and then on its own line, you can literally instantiate the view model as a line of XAML in the XAML, which is super cool and easy. They also have, as you mentioned, locator patterns. Just like view model first, you can start view first and then just say, okay, we'll add the word model to this and find the appropriate class and instantiate that. I don't know if I totally get or agree with what you said about the data first or the view model being more important and that being why we start with the view model, simply because, you could still have a throwaway view and instantiate a very complex view model from it. I guess the one thing is constructor parameters get in the way of pretty much any of this. Any type of automated locating or
and the servicey locator pattern can kind of do that, where you've preset up your DI container so it knows how to create those instances of view models. And that does work, but those are the sort of reasons why I can create my view models very quickly with the data in my models and then just kind of send them out. I do it's a hacky pattern, and it's really weird. I have not seen anyone else do this, and I've looked. And so I don't think I'm the first person to come up with this, but I'm the only person I know of who came up with this. And that is, I built this thing I call a dynamic view model. It's a dynamic object, so it abuses the dynamic keywords in C#, And the idea behind it is that it has a single constructor parameter, which is basically a t, just a value. And
Hmm.
then since it's dynamic, it stores that value. And then anytime anything tries to call a property, it reflects onto the model. It's a perfect dynamic pass through. And what that lets me do is I can wire up I notify property changed using all of the dynamic types on there. And so I just have this thing called a dynamic view model, and I can just pass any of my models, which are my entities. They're just POCOs, they're just get sets. I can pass those straight to my view through this dynamic view model, and it wires everything up for me. All the property notify, it manages all of that in a very clean way. And because I'm able to do that, then the only downside of it is that when you're designing your XAML, it will complain to you that it cannot verify that that property exists on data context because
Sure.
it's dynamic, so it can't find that out. But it does
Right.
work perfectly at runtime, and you can just reflect through. But because I'm doing that, I can't service locate those as easily because they're just these dynamic objects kind of being thrown around. And so
Mhm.
for me, that's where building those view models gets a little bit easier because I've just got this list of like persons and I just wrap those in a dynamic view model and then kick those out. And then when it comes to the view, my particular implementation of the view locator takes into account if it's a dynamic view model, what's the underlying type, and then it uses that to look up the view. So there's a few extra hoops. But
So let me ask you, because like with this idea of we're just, some sort of record of people, in my head, one of the reasons to have something between the model and the view, whether it's a controller or a view model or whatever you want to call it, is that we can modify the data in the UI and not persist those changes until we click save.
yes,
But if you have a dynamic view model, does that automatically change your model?
yes.
Right? Do you see the problem that?
Yeah, and this goes into my architecture design where my entities are my models. I built my POCOs with, they don't implement iNotify property changed. They're just getters and setters and an empty constructor to be used with
Mhm.
my ORM. But since that's what they're designed to do, once they're in memory, they haven't been persisted
Okay.
because I know that they're tied into an ORM somewhere, that they're there. So when I hand them to my views, my thought is that's exactly what they're designed to do, is be modified in real time,
Okay.
because then I've got like a validator. So I've got, let's say, a person validator sitting out there, and it has nothing to do with the ORM or the UI or anything. It simply says, given this person, is all of the information that's in there what I consider to be valid? And if not, return an error code. And I built that. It's just designed to stand alone and do its own thing.
Mhm.
But then I can take that and I can put that in my ORM implementation and say, if you're trying to insert this, it has to be validated before it gets inserted. But then I can also take that behavior and I can put it into the UI. Since I'm just mutating it, I can click save and change the name or whatever like that. It's just persisting to this model. I can use that same validator with my view model using that I validate or whatever the exact interface is. I can just piggyback on top of that and then just fire off those validators, get their error messages, and kick them back up. And so I don't mind mutating those properties because once that object
Mhm.
is in memory, I'm intending on, at least in the instance of heading to a view, that that thing is the thing that I'm already mutating. And it doesn't really matter, even when they click save, then it'll take it, fire it through the validator one last time just to be absolutely sure, and then it will run through my ORM and hit my database. But
Right.
I don't have any problem mutating it in memory because it's not a one-to-one. It's not like I change that property and it fires off to the database, a save method right away.
Sure.
So in that case, I'm using my models as my entities. I don't have any other middle ground. So I'm very much intending on them being manipulated in that way because they're intended on going right back to the database, not
Right.
being, mapped into different DTOs or whatever else you might have them
Yeah,
as.
I guess that makes sense. In my mind, it was just the idea that as soon as I mutate the actual model, I'm going to save it. And so in that case, the view model holds on to the current state,
Hmm.
and the model is only used for loading and saving. So
I
just
see.
a
I
different way
see.
to look at it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if my pattern is necessarily good or bad. It's just what I found in my application to be a very quick way to iterate over things. And that's
Hmm.
really my opinion, like MVVM and WPF and these frameworks, is I try not to overcomplicate things. They're just designed to display data to people.
Sure.
And so for me, it was like, I'm going to concern myself with the data, and then I'm just going to let the view kind of be this thing that, because I'm not really a good UI guy, I could just knock together something and it would be fine. But then I could also hire somebody else out and have them use like Blend or something to generate better view. But since I always considered the view the afterthought, I always considered it to be the last thing I'd ever want to make any decisions on, that's why I always tried to stick very model first, view model first. And even though my stylet is designed for WPF and MVVM, so in a way I am kind of locking myself to that, but the models are still, completely independent of everything.
So I wanted to back up for a minute, back to the conversation about whether or not controls should have their own view models.
Well, I said yes.
I'm not sure if we really exhausted that. And I completely get the idea that if you're building a complex view in XAML, then obviously that makes it more complicated if every control needs its own view model. If it's view first and it's just going to go out and fetch one, fine, but otherwise that could be tricky. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that there's a great Stack Overflow, and I'll have to find the link. I will get it in the show notes for sure. But did I show that to you at work, Tim?
I'm not sure if you did.
It had hundreds of comments and upvotes and downvotes, and it was asking exactly this question: should a control have a view model?
Mhm.
And the accepted answer was no, and gave the reasons why no. And the most upvoted answers was yes, and gave the reasons why yes. And
I don't
so
think it.
obviously we're not the only ones that
Yeah,
have this question.
yeah. I mean, I don't think it always has to. Um, to me, yeah, it doesn't always have to, but a control is kind of it's model view model, but in a way the control is the view model, but on
Mm-hmm.
another way it's a very tightly coupled view model. A WPF view is expecting a WPF friendly view model. That's the controller, the user controller, the window, versus say WinForms is expecting a form or a panel or their own version of things.
Mm-hmm.
If you're pretty locked into a technology, like, hey, we're doing WPF, that's it. We're only worried about WPF, that's it. Then I think your controls can probably be their own view model. You can subclass out, this is my own version of a list control, or this is my own version of a tab control, and
Right.
you can put the logic in there. But I don't see any reason not to. But you're making this very clear that I'm only ever using WPF and VVM. I'm never going to change this, or it's far enough down the line that there's no point in future proofing ourselves. I think as soon as you start thinking, well, man, we might want to do something web based or we want to do something Xamarin based, then having a separate view model that is as completely unbiased as possible makes the most sense, because then you can still subclass out your own version of a list or a tab control or whatever, but then you can just use this really common reusable view model there, and then you don't have to write a completely new one if you're going to touch Xamarin. You don't have to write a completely new one if you do something else. And
Yeah.
so that feels like, in my head, how I would look at it.
Yeah, and that brings up, I was thinking, we had the episode on Blazor too, but the thing about Blazor, you can still do MVVM with Blazor, of course, which I do, but the view is constructed so differently than XAML views for WPF and Xamarin Forms, because it's actually constructed and it has C
Mhm.
sharp interjected in the construction. And so it's in some ways a lot easier because you could do a new whatever the heck you need in there. You can do just in C sharp, you can do this is the model and this, or this is the view and this is the view model here, put them together. All of that stuff is just more declarative and more in line. You can see the construction. Whereas XAML, you know, I think, if we had something like that was like C sharp and XAML interspersed, then that might solve a lot of problems, because you could easily, like, iterating over a collection is super easy in Blazor, because you just say you do a for loop and then you just spit out the div or the input or whatever other control every time you go through the for loop. Whereas in XAML, you have to say, well, this is a list view and here's the template, and then it just has to guess and go find the collection and all that.
Yeah. And that is one of the big downsides of WPF, is kind of the way they did things does offer that split. But I also think that's just another reason, because if you build a view model that is separate than the control, you can use that view model in Blazor. And, that's where I would come from in that discussion question, is whether they should have, their own view models, and how expansive do you think it's going to be? I would probably say yes. I would probably do view models for all of those. Most of mine in my personal project are view models, even though I never intended on doing anything other than WPF. My controls are usually very quick pass-throughs. They're, not really designed to do anything else. So I didn't want to do anything else with them. I just wanted a really concrete view model that I could pass through.
Well, anything else that we've forgotten about MVVM?
I wish it was easier. It was a big cliff for me to learn. It took me a really long time to feel genuinely comfortable working with WPF and MVVM. I'm still not great with it. I really wish Rider had better support for it. It basically won't run if you've got resource dictionaries. It won't run for a million other reasons, but Visual Studio doesn't run on our work project very well, so it's just difficult for me to edit it. And it's kind of disappointing that it wasn't done in a much cleaner way. And so that's why I usually just find a framework, find something that will help you. I mean, there's plenty of great ones out there that are free. They all have different use cases. Find one that works, and then just use that, and then kind of don't worry about it too much. With Maui coming out, and Xamarin and Blazor and all these other technologies, yes, WPF over WinForms. Full stop. Yes, don't use WinForms anymore. Use WPF, but don't worry so much about your UI technology, because they're changing and there's new ones all the time. And hopefully Maui will be the big end all be all. It might not be. There might be a new one in a year after that. But I've seen so many UI frameworks come and go in C#. I mean, there's even ones like Avalonia. I'm not sure if you've heard that exists as a cross-platform one. And it's just, they come and go. Don't get so hung up on it. There's always going to be a new way to view the data, but build really robust view models. Think about that sort of thing, so that when the new UI thing comes out that you're expected to support, you can do that a lot easier. And I think trying to, you can roll your own WPF everything, your own iCommand, you can roll your own observable collection because the one that's built in is not thread safe. You can roll all of those, or you can just use a third-party package that will do it all for you. And there's a lot of great ones out there. I would just use those and not worry so much about it, because you can make them all do it. I mean, I could have done my entire program view first. It would have been a little bit more of a pain, but it would have worked fine. And you can do them either way. You can use whatever dependency injection framework you want to use. There's a million options out there, but you're really not going to get locked in.
Yep, I say that pretty much covers it.
Yeah. A little long-winded, perhaps.
So hopefully we won't have to do MVVM Part 3 in a few weeks.
Well, I would love to do an episode on Maui. Like, once Maui kind of hits like a something that we can play with and genuinely use, I would like to do a cast on Maui.
Well, and I think doing a Xamarin Forms episode would even be a good lead into that, since Maui is supposed to be based on Xamarin Forms. We could go into more depth on that right now and not have to wait for it.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's move on to our hotspots. So I have a new hotspot that I discovered. Actually, somebody told me about it and I tried it out. And, I, just like you, I am not a designer, right? I am not a creative artist. I was a musician. I'm creative in that way, but not in visual arts. So I tend to do UIs that are very functional and very square and straightforward. But I found this cool tool, or I was told about this cool tool called Zeppelin. And it's not spelled like an actual Zeppelin, the blimp, although that is their logo. It's Zeplin. And basically, what it does is it will take a design file from Photoshop, from Adobe Photoshop or Adobe XD, which is used for actual mobile app layouts and things like that. And it will import these as components. And you can click on them and you can see, how many, depending on if you set it up to be like an iOS view or something else. Like the one I was looking at was an iOS view, so it was in points because everything is in points in iOS instead of in pixels. So it would say this control is 68 points high, and it's the margin is 24, and you can just hover over all these things and see that. You can also extract all of the images in it as assets, and it will even do different sizes of the same asset, which is important for mobile development. And so you could just extract those and put them right into your repository for your project. And the coolest thing is it has a bunch of extensions that will essentially generate code snippets for that component and that view that you're looking at. So I installed the Xamarin Forms extension, and if I click on any piece of that UI, I will get a little snippet that says, well, here's how you could create a view that looks just like that in Xamarin Forms. Well, you're going to need a frame because this has a border around it. And in Xamarin Forms, that's called a frame. And you're going to need a stack layout because you're, doing various pieces in there. So I thought that was a really neat way of bridging that divide, especially if you do get to work with a designer, that you could both work on these same files, and you could literally take their components that they designed and translate them into, like I said, I did it with Xamarin Forms, but I think JavaScript and CSS are built right into it, or HTML and CSS. And I know there were a lot of other extensions for other software to get that code output.
That's very cool.
And it's free, at least to start. Well, let's see. One project is free. If you want to do more than one project, then you start paying money. But that means at least you can check it out and, see all the things I'm talking about there for free. I will say that if you're not a designer and you don't have any Adobe files like Adobe Photoshop or Adobe XD, then you may want to also download one of those, because I needed to do that to create my designs in the first place. But if you're already working with a designer who uses those, or if you are a designer who uses those, then I would just download this and try importing them.
Microsoft came up with something called Blend at one point when WPF was first coming out that I think is quasi-similar. Let somebody kind of lay out a form and not worry so much about anything there, and then it could later be converted to the XAML file, and then you could just do all the binding afterward. So
Right.
those utilities are really nice to see. I think especially as teams get a bit bigger and you ever need to pull a designer on there, it's nice to let the designer work in their preferred tools and not have to worry about any of the other stuff. And then we can just get a file from them, and then, oh, here we go. We can generate all the code and not have to have worried about, don't limit them as an artist. Let them draw and do whatever. And then later on,
Right.
we can figure out how to make it work.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could, so I also experimented with Adobe XD, and you could say specific components were exportable as assets or not. And so let's say you have this really cool thing that has a swirly border around it. well, obviously we're not just going to use the built-in border tools in any of our UI frameworks to get that. We're going to have to actually import the asset, import the image, and use that as the frame. But it's still possible to do all of that.
Well, that is pretty cool. I wish I had as cool of a hotspot. I guess I've been so busy doing all of the same stuff, I haven't used any new tools lately. And I find myself wondering, and I guess it's a quick ponder, is it good to always be seeking out new tools, or is it better to get good with the tools that you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I try to master the tools that I have, so I'm not always learning about new types of software or anything.
Well, this sounds like just a cop out that you can't go.
Well, it is a cop out, but it's also kind of that. There was a discussion on a Medium article I was reading the other week, which is there's this popular conception that every coder is expected to like go home and be working for another 4 hours on their own personal coding projects and know
Right.
10,000 different tools and 10,000 different languages and all of that. And the discussion was, however, that's kind of a harmful thought process, that you always need to be learning a new technology. You always need to be doing your own personal coding and all of that, because not everybody works that way. Not everybody wants to have that kind of exposure. And I guess that's kind of why, like, sometimes I have a hotspot, but a lot of times it's more personal, like the things that I'm doing, because I'm not usually going out there and learning new software packages or that sort of thing. Like, I'm writing my own ORM because I wanted to, because I want to challenge myself to see if I can write something like that. I never intend on it being used anywhere. It's just my deep dive is less of a tooling, more of a how would I write an ORM. And I'm specifically not looking at the source code for anything else, like nothing, because I want to figure that out for myself. And so I've already kind of done that as a hotspot, which was look at the source code for things, understand how things work. And sometimes it's fun to write your own. You never know what you're going to learn about something. And in my research of writing my own ORM, I found a bunch of really cool articles on other people who've done the same, and here's some pointers. And so I guess that's how I would discover stuff, is in my own personal projects, whatever I have to learn. And so I guess I just haven't run into anything cool like Zeppelin.
Well, if you are listening to this podcast and you have a hotspot for Tim, it's something that you should learn. Or for me, actually. I think we got our first iTunes review, except it wasn't a review, it was only a rating. But it was 5 stars.
Oh,
so
there
that
we go.
was good.
There we go.
So we have a 5-star rating in iTunes. So everyone should be listening to this because that one person gave us a 5-star rating. So if you have some comments, some hot spots, some things that you'd like us to talk about, please do let us know. I'm open to comments at tocode.software, or, like I said, an actual review on the iTunes podcast app would be excellent, or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever you get your podcasts. And yeah, like I was going to do a drawing and everything, but we just haven't had that much input yet. Even like I said, this was just a rating, so I don't even know who did it. So I can't say thank you to the person who did that rating for us.
You said thank you out loud, and I hope they're listening, and
Yes.
I hope that they'll understand the appreciation.
And I think I did mention this last week in the episode too, or last time in the episode. We've been getting a little bit slower with our rollout.
Yep.
Please pass the word on. If you enjoy this, tell a friend, invite them in, and let's get the discussion going.
If anybody suggests a hotspot for me, I will absolutely promise you anything suggested to me, I will spend time to research it and read it and learn what it has to do, because why not? Learning about something that's so completely outside of anything I normally know, it can be a lot of fun.
Sure. Well, Tim, have a great week.
Yeah, you do as well.